William adjusted the knot of his tie, the reflection in the mirror showing a man who had everything, except the freedom to choose the woman who would be in his bed that night. The contract was signed. The party of appearances had ended, and now all that remained was the final act, confronting the young gold digger his family had pushed on him as a wife. He descended the mansion's marble staircase, his heart a block of ice, rehearsing the cruel words he would use to make it clear that their marriage was a farce. He would humiliate her, put her in her place, and then leave her to the solitude of that gilded cage. Chloe, on the other hand, heard his footsteps approaching the bridal suite, and her body trembled, not from cold but from pure terror. She shrank into the silk sheets, her white dress still on her body like useless armor. She knew he despised her, but she couldn't have imagined that the truth of that night would not only save her from humiliation, but transform her tormentor into a man she could barely recognize. The ceremony had been a spectacle of orchestrated coldness. To the guests, it was the wedding of the year, the union of William, the heir to a financial empire, and the stunning Chloe, a young woman of ethereal beauty whose family was suddenly saved from bankruptcy. Smiles were exchanged, champagne glasses were raised in empty toasts, and the press recorded every detail of the luxurious charade. Behind the cameras, however, the reality was a desert of emotion. William barely looked at her at the altar. His hand, when he held hers to exchange the rings, was as cold as the metal he slid onto her finger. He felt the gazes of pity and envy on his bride, and a knot of contempt formed in his stomach. He saw in her the personification of her father's greed, a man who didn't hesitate to sell his own daughter to maintain his lifestyle. And she, with her frightened eyes and timid posture, was, in his mind, a talented actress, masterfully playing the part of the innocent victim. Chloe, for her part, felt every stare like a needle piercing her skin. The wedding dress, a couture piece that cost more than she could ever dream of earning in a lifetime, felt like a heavy, suffocating costume. Beside William, she felt diminished, a decorative piece in an event celebrating her own sentence. The stunning beauty everyone remarked upon was, to her, a curse, the very reason she had been chosen for this sacrifice. Throughout the party, he guided her through the ballrooms with the firmness of someone handling a valuable asset, not a wife. He smiled for business partners, for friends, but as soon as their backs were turned, the mask would fall, and what remained was a cutting glare of indifference that made her want to disappear. She saw her father laughing, slapping the backs of his new wealthy friends, and her mother wearing a sad smile, who would look away whenever their eyes met. They had handed her over, and now she was completely alone. The drive from the party to the mansion was made in a sepulchral silence. The luxury car glided through the city's illuminated streets, but inside the vehicle the darkness was palpable. William stared out the window, his jaw tight, ignoring her presence as if she were a ghost. Chloe kept her hands clasped in her lap, her nails digging into her own skin, a vain attempt to feel something other than the overwhelming fear rising in her throat. She looked at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the broad shoulders under the impeccable suit. He was, objectively, a very handsome man, the kind who graced the covers of business magazines, but his beauty was intimidating, icy, a facade for the cruelty she felt emanating from him. Upon arriving at the mansion, a modern palace of glass and concrete that looked more like a museum than a home, they were greeted by a woman with graying hair and a kind gaze. "Welcome, ma'am," she said in a soft voice. "My name is Mrs. Davies. I'm the housekeeper. I'll be at your disposal for whatever you need." "Thank you, Mrs. Davies," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first drop of human warmth she had received in hours. William didn't say a word, merely gesturing with his head toward the staircase. "Mrs. Davies, show my eye, wife," to her room. The pause before wife was deliberate, a small cut, a way of reminding her that her new title was just a formality. Mrs. Davies shot a quick, understanding glance at Chloe before guiding her up the monumental staircase. "Mr. Sterling is a complicated man," the housekeeper said in a low voice as if sharing a secret. "But he has a good heart in there somewhere." Chloe highly doubted it. The room was larger than the entire apartment she had grown up in. A canopied king-size bed dominated the center, covered in silk sheets that seemed liquid to the touch. A glass door opened onto a private balcony overlooking a perfectly manicured garden. It was a princess's room, a gilded cage, Mrs. Davies showed her the walk-in closet already crammed with clothes she had never chosen, and the marble bathroom with a tub that looked like a small swimming pool. Then, with a final sympathetic look, the housekeeper withdrew, closing the door softly and leaving Chloe in absolute solitude. The hours dragged on. Chloe didn't have the courage to take off the dress. She sat on the edge of the bed, her body rigid, every noise in the house making her heart race. She heard the clink of a glass from somewhere downstairs. Then heavy footsteps. He was coming. The fear that had been a constant hum now became a deafening scream in her mind. The doorknob turned. William entered the room without knocking, his jacket removed, his tie loosened. His eyes swept the room and landed on her, huddled on the bed. A cynical smile curved his lips. He poured himself a whiskey from a decanter on a small side table and walked slowly toward her, like a predator cornering its prey. Then he began, his voice deep and laden with sarcasm. "So, the little Cinderella has finally arrived at her castle. Are you happy? The price was high, but your father seemed quite pleased with the deal." Chloe swallowed hard, unable to respond. His words were exactly as she'd expected, cruel, direct, humiliating. He stopped a few feet from her, the whiskey glass swirling in his hand. "Let's get things clear, Chloe. You are here for one reason. To give my family the corporate merger they so desperately wanted, and eventually an heir to keep up appearances. Other than that, your existence in this house will be irrelevant to me. You'll have everything money can buy, clothes, jewelry, trips. In return, you will ask no questions, you will not meddle in my affairs, and above all, you will not pretend this is a real marriage." He paused, waiting for a reaction. When she remained silent, just trembling visibly, his irritation grew. He had expected tears, pleas, or maybe a spark of defiance from a cornered gold digger. Her terrified silence unnerved him. "Aren't you going to say anything?" he snarled, taking a step forward. "Not going to try and convince me of your innocence? Tell me you've fallen desperately in love with the millionaire ogre?" I don't know what to say," she finally managed, her voice choked. "Oh, you don't?" he mocked, moving even closer until she could smell the whiskey and the expensive cologne he wore. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "Then I'll say it for you. You are a commodity, bought and paid for. I expect you to fulfill your part of the deal. But don't worry," he added, his tone dripping with venom. "I have no interest in touching you. Women like you who sell themselves so easily don't appeal to me. You can save your stage virginity for whoever might be interested." The accusation hit her like a slap. The injustice of his words, the way he assumed the worst of her without even knowing her, broke through the barrier of her fear. Tears of anger and humiliation welled in her eyes. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "Oh, I know everything I need to," he retorted, his contempt plain. "I know your father was drowning in debt and saw my name as his salvation, and I know you accepted the role willingly. I had no choice. There's always a choice." He exploded, the fury he had kept contained finally erupting. He grabbed her arm, the force of his grip making her flinch. "You could have said no. But luxury spoke louder, didn't it? The easy life, no," she cried, the tears now streaming freely down her face. "Do you think I wanted this? To be sold, to be treated like an object? Look at me," she challenged him, lifting her chin. "Do you think I'm faking this terror? The disgust I feel for this situation?" He stared at her, caught off guard by her outburst. For an instant, he saw something in her dark, tear-filled eyes that wasn't an act. It was pure, genuine pain. But his cynicism was a fortress. "An excellent performance," he said, his voice lower, releasing her abruptly. "But it won't work on me. Now let's get to it. I'll be sleeping in the room next door. This one is yours. Tomorrow, we'll lay out the definitive rules of our contract." He turned to leave, a bitter taste in his mouth. The scene hadn't gone as planned. He'd wanted to feel victorious, in control. Instead, he felt dirty. As he reached the door, her voice, as fragile as a silk thread, stopped him. "You said?" "Staged virginity." He turned slowly, one eyebrow arched. "Yes, it's the oldest trick in the book. The pure, untouched bride. A shame I don't believe in fairy tales." Chloe took a deep breath, gathering the last spark of courage she had left. It was her only truth, the one thing that was still hers in this world of lies. "It's not an act," she said, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it. "I am a virgin." The declaration hung in the air, charged with an unexpected weight. William stood, motionless. He scanned her from head to toe, searching for any sign of deceit, any hint of a lie. But all he found was a pair of terrified, sincere eyes, a pale face stained with tears, and a vulnerability so raw it was almost impossible to fake. His certainty, the armor of arrogance that protected him, began to crack. He laughed, but the sound came out hollow, unconvincing. "Nice try." "It's the truth," she insisted, her chin trembling. "My father sold me to you, but he couldn't take my honor. No one could. I was saving it for someone who would love me." The last part came out as a painful sob. The silence that followed was deafening. In William's mind, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a new, disturbing way. Her terror at the altar, her trembling hands, her refusal to meet his gaze. It wasn't the behavior of an experienced gold digger. It was the panic of an innocent being led to the slaughter. The line from the thumbnail echoed in his head. He was ready to humiliate her, only to discover he was the one who had been deceived. He hadn't been deceived by her. He'd been deceived by his own assumptions, by his cynical worldview that had painted a victim in the colors of a predator. He wasn't the tormentor of a schemer. He was the unwitting accomplice in the sacrifice of a young woman. The contempt he felt dissolved, replaced by a wave of something he couldn't name. It was a mixture of shock, guilt, and overwhelming confusion. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and didn't see the trophy, the bargain, the liar. He saw a terrified, lonely 22-year-old girl, trapped in a predicament as cruel as his own. Without another word, he turned and left the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the mansion's quiet. Chloe heard his footsteps retreat down the hall, and, for the first time that night, she let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body collapsing onto the silk sheets in a convulsive fit of relief and despair. In the hallway, William leaned against the wall, his head in his hands. The plan to humiliate her was in tatters, and in place of his cold rage, an uncomfortable question began to form. If she was the victim, what did that make him? The next morning dawned in a tense silence. Chloe had barely slept, haunted by the emotional roller coaster of the previous night. The image of William's shocked face before he left was seared into her mind. She didn't know what to expect. Another wave of accusations? An even colder contempt? With her heart hammering against her ribs, she put on one of the simple dresses Mrs. Davies had provided, feeling like an imposter amidst the luxury, and went down to the dining room. The space was as vast and imposing as the rest of the house. With a polished mahogany table that could seat 20, William was already there at the head, reading the news on a tablet. He looked up as she entered. There was no warmth in his gaze, but the cutting contempt from the night before was gone, replaced by a neutral, almost analytical expression. "Good morning," he said, his voice even. "Mrs. Davies informed me you like coffee with milk and fruit. I had it prepared." Chloe froze for a second. The small consideration was so unexpected it left her speechless. "Oh, thank you," she stammered, sitting as far down the table as etiquette would allow. The silence settled in again, broken only by the clinking of silverware. She ate in small bites, feeling his eyes on her from time to time. He was studying her, and it made her nervous, but it was a different kind of nervousness than the dread of the night before. It was the uncertainty of not knowing what ground she was standing on. The fragile truce was abruptly shattered by the arrival of an older woman, elegantly dressed in a designer suit and a pearl necklace that radiated disapproval. Her perfectly coiffed hair framed a face where arrogance was etched into every line. "William, darling," she said, her voice affected before planting a kiss in the air beside her son's cheek. Her icy eyes then landed on Chloe. "And you must be the bride." The word sounded like an insult. "Mother," William said, his tone suddenly colder. "This is Chloe, my wife." "Chloe, this is my mother, Eleanor." "Wife, of course," Eleanor murmured, sitting down and examining Chloe from head to toe with a critical eye. "A rather simple dress for the lady of the house, don't you think? I would have expected something more appropriate." Chloe's face burned. She wanted to shrink, to disappear under the table. Before she could think of a response, William's voice cut through the air. "Her dress is fine, Mother, and she doesn't need your approval on how to dress." The sharpness in his voice was unmistakable. Eleanor's eyes widened, clearly surprised and offended by her son's defense. Chloe looked at William, stunned. He hadn't defended her with kindness, but with the precision of a scalpel, effectively silencing his mother. Eleanor changed the subject, talking about an art auction, but the mood at the table had shifted. William, the man who had humiliated her, had just protected her. The confusion inside Chloe deepened. In the days that followed, William maintained a calculated distance. He left early for the office and came home late, and they rarely crossed paths. Yet, Chloe felt his presence in other ways, small things. He had left instructions that no one was to bother her. He had ensured Mrs. Davies was always available for whatever she needed. He didn't speak to her, but somehow he was building a bubble of neutrality around her. Free from his direct hostility, Chloe began to explore her new environment with the caution of a frightened animal. The mansion was cold and impersonal, but she found little refuges. The library, with its smell of old books and leather, became a sanctuary, and the garden, an oasis of life amidst the sterile architecture. It was there that he found her one afternoon. She was sitting on a stone bench under a weeping willow, so absorbed in a worn paperback novel that she didn't hear him approach. It was a book she had brought from her old home, one of the few personal belongings she had there. William stopped a short distance away watching her. The sunlight filtered through the willow leaves, creating patterns on her dark hair. In that soft light, with a serene expression on her face, she looked even younger and more out of place. He noticed the simplicity of her gestures, the way she smiled at a passage in the book, the kindness with which she greeted a gardener who walked by. Nothing in her behavior screamed gold digger. Everything about her whispered a genuineness that deeply unsettled him. He fought his instincts. Years of distrust and betrayal had taught him to always look for the ulterior motive, the hidden agenda. But with Chloe, he found nothing. Acting on an impulse he didn't understand, he stepped forward. "What are you reading?" he asked. Chloe jumped, nearly dropping the book. "Mr. Sterling," she exclaimed, her face flushing. I didn't hear you." "Just William," he corrected, his voice softer than he'd intended. He moved closer and glanced at the book's cover. It was a classic romance, nothing sophisticated. "Is it any good?" "Yes," she replied, surprised by the question. "It's my favorite story, about finding beauty in the most unexpected things." The sentence hung between them, charged with unintentional meaning. He felt it. Words were stuck in his throat. It was the first real conversation they'd had, devoid of accusations or formalities. It lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to crack a layer of ice. He walked away, leaving her with a racing heart and a new feeling blooming in her chest: curiosity. The truth, however, was too fragile for the outside world. 2 weeks after the wedding, William announced they had to attend a charity ball. "It's important for the company's image." "For our image," he said, the last part spoken with an almost imperceptible hesitation. Panic seized Chloe. The thought of facing high society, the stares, the whispers, was terrifying. On the night of the event, she looked at herself in the mirror, wearing a blue silk gown Mrs. Davies had helped her choose. It was elegant and understated, but she felt like a fraud. William came into the room to get her. He stopped at the door, his gaze sweeping over her for a moment. For a fraction of a second, she thought she saw a flicker of admiration in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with his usual indifference. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, and he offered his arm. The contact of her hand on his suit sleeve sent an electric shock through her. The ballroom was a whirlwind of glitter and forced conversation. Chloe clung to William's arm like a life raft, smiling shyly at the people she was introduced to. She could feel the appraising glances, the women who measured her from head to toe, trying to find a flaw. It was then that a woman approached, gliding through the room with the confidence of a panther. She was tall, blonde, and wore a red dress that seemed sewn onto her body. Her smile was bright, but her eyes were as hard as diamonds. "William, my dear, I thought you'd hidden yourself from the world," she said, her voice a dangerous purr. She ignored Chloe completely. "Victoria," William replied, his body tensing subtly. "Always a pleasure." Victoria's eyes finally fixed on Chloe, a flicker of disdain crossing them. And this must be the new Mrs. Sterling. What a meteoric rise. "Is it true, then, that you charmed him with that fairy tale innocence of yours?" The venom in her voice was unmistakable. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. People nearby fell silent, eager for the drama. It was a public humiliation, calculated to destroy her. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. She felt William's arm contract under her hand. "Victoria," he said, his voice low and lethal, cutting through the air like a blade. "I believe you're confusing innocence with class, something Chloe has in abundance and which you've apparently misplaced somewhere along the way." Victoria's smile faltered. The insult was so direct, so brutal, it left her speechless. William didn't wait for a response. He gave Chloe's hand a reassuring squeeze and led her away, leaving Victoria in the middle of the ballroom, her face contorted in a mask of fury and humiliation. "Let's get some air," he said to Chloe, guiding her to the quiet of a terrace overlooking the city. They stood in silence for a long time, the sound of the party a distant hum. Chloe was trembling, no longer from fear, but from an overwhelming emotion she couldn't identify. "Thank you," she whispered, finally breaking the silence. William looked at her, the city skyline reflected in his eyes. "She had no right to speak to you that way." "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice genuinely curious. "You hate me." He turned to face her, the night breeze stirring a lock of his hair. His expression was serious, unreadable. "I don't hate you, Chloe," he said, and it sounded as if he were admitting it to himself for the first time. "I hate the situation we were forced into, but you are my wife, and no one will disrespect you while you carry my name." That night, on the way home, the silence in the car was no longer one of hostility or awkwardness. It was a silence charged with possibilities, with unasked questions, and a new, fragile connection that had been forged in the fire of an enemy's attack. When they arrived at the mansion, he walked her to her bedroom door. For a moment, their eyes met and held, and an electric current of pure tension passed between them. He looked like he was about to say something more, but he just nodded and went to his own room. Chloe went inside and leaned against the door, her heart pounding. That man of ice, her contractual tormentor, had become her protector, and that truth was, somehow, more terrifying and infinitely more dangerous than all of his contempt. The days following the charity ball were marked by a strange new harmony. The wall of ice between William and Chloe hadn't completely disappeared, but it was riddled with cracks, through which brief glances, words exchanged beyond mere formality, and a silence that now felt charged with expectation, escaped. William began to come home from the office earlier. He didn't seek her out directly, but his routes through the house seemed to coincide with hers with suspicious frequency. He would find her in the library, reading by the window, and instead of walking past, he would stop for a moment to ask about the story. Or he would see her in the garden, tending to a seemingly abandoned rosebush, and feel an inexplicable urge to join her. He was a fascinated observer, watching the woman he had been forced to marry transform his cold fortress into something that hesitantly began to resemble a home. Chloe, in turn, sensed the change in him, and it both frightened and intrigued her. His presence was no longer a threat, but a magnetic field that drew her in and pushed her away. She found herself thinking about him during the day, trying to decipher the man behind the facade of the ruthless millionaire. It was on one of those afternoons, while helping Mrs. Davies organize some books, that she found a small opening. "Mr. Sterling, William, seems different," Chloe commented in a low voice. Mrs. Davies smiled, a wise smile from someone who had seen many seasons pass in that house. "The boy William wasn't always so hard, my dear. His father was a man of steel who demanded perfection in everything. He taught his son to see the world as a battlefield and people as pieces in a game. He never learned to trust." The housekeeper paused, straightening a book on the shelf. After a great romantic disappointment a few years ago, he closed himself off completely. "I think he forgot what it's like to have someone real by his side." Mrs. Davies's words planted a seed of understanding in Chloe's heart. For the first time, she saw not just the man who despised her, but a lonely man, wounded by his own distrust. This new dynamic would soon be tested. There was another unavoidable event on the social calendar, the annual company gala. This time, when William told her about it, Chloe's panic was less, replaced by a nervous apprehension. At his side, she felt a little safer. On the night of the party, she chose an emerald green dress that highlighted her eyes. When she came down the stairs, she found William waiting. He stood silent for a long moment, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her blush to the roots of her hair. "You look beautiful, Chloe," he said, his voice a little hoarse. It was the first compliment he had ever given her, and the words sounded in her ears like the most beautiful music. The gala was even larger and more opulent than the ball. And if Victoria was a direct threat, there were other predators in that environment, more subtle and equally dangerous. While William went to greet a group of investors, a man with an easy smile and an oily gaze approached Chloe. It was Damien. William's main business rival, known for his charm and complete lack of scruples. "Chloe Sterling," he said, taking her hand and placing a lingering kiss on it. "I finally have the pleasure of meeting the mysterious woman who captured the ice-cold heart of our William. He certainly keeps you hidden under lock and key." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Chloe replied, trying to discreetly pull her hand back. "Damien, please. And the pleasure is all mine," he insisted, his thumb stroking her skin. "William doesn't deserve you, you know. A man who only thinks about numbers. A beauty like yours should be appreciated, celebrated, not locked in an ivory tower." Across the room, William watched the scene. His grip on his champagne flute became so tight it was a miracle the crystal didn't shatter. A wave of primitive, hot, possessive fury surged through him. It was an emotion so visceral it caught him by surprise. It wasn't the irritation of a rival bothering his property. It was jealousy, pure, irrational, and overwhelming. He saw Chloe's discomfort, the way she tried to step away from Damien, and the smug smile on his rival's face. That was the last straw. In 3 long strides, he crossed the room. "Damien," William said, his voice dangerously calm. He didn't look at his rival. His eyes were fixed on Chloe. With a gesture that was both protective and possessive, he placed his hand on the small of her back, pulling her against his body. The warmth of his hand through the fabric of her dress made her hold her breath. "I believe my wife and I were about to dance." Damien raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, friend. I was just keeping this charming lady company." "She already has company," William retorted, his gaze promising retaliation. Without waiting for a reply, he guided Chloe to the dance floor, sweeping her into his arms. The music was a slow waltz. At first, their bodies were stiff, the tension from the confrontation still vibrating in the air. But gradually, to the sound of the melody, they began to relax. His hand on her back was firm and warm. The other held hers with a gentleness that contradicted his fury moments before. Chloe rested her head on his shoulder, inhaling his scent, a mix of wood smoke and something uniquely him. For the first time, she felt completely safe in his arms. And he, feeling her trusting weight against his chest, realized that protecting Chloe had become as natural as breathing. The ride home was silent, but the electricity between them was almost palpable. When they arrived at the mansion, however, the night's magic shattered. Eleanor was waiting for them in the living room, her face a mask of icy fury. "I cannot believe the scene I was told about," she hissed, rising to her feet. "You, William, publicly threatening Damien over her. She's turning you into a fool, a puppet. This girl and her family of leeches are blinding you." "Enough, mother," William exploded, his voice echoing through the entrance hall. "I will not allow you to speak about my wife that way." "Your wife?" Eleanor laughed, a cruel sound. "She's a contract. A business deal that is costing our family its dignity. Can't you see she's manipulating you with this fake sweetness?" Every word was a blow to Chloe. The tears she had held back during the confrontation with Damien now threatened to overflow. Unable to bear any more, she murmured an "excuse me" and ran up the stairs, seeking refuge in the solitude of her room, or rather on the balcony, where the cold night air might numb the pain. William watched her flee, his heart tight with anger and guilt. He turned to his mother. "If you cannot treat her with a shred of respect, then you are not welcome in this house," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Leaving a shocked and speechless Eleanor behind, he went up the stairs, not to his own room, but to hers. He found her on the balcony, hugging her knees, her body shaken by silent sobs. The sight of her, so fragile and desolate, broke the last of his defenses. He approached slowly and, instead of speaking, sat on the stone floor beside her. They stayed like that for a few minutes, her crying gradually subsiding. It was Chloe who broke the silence, her voice choked. "Your mother, she hates you because of me." He had expected her to talk about her own pain, but instead, she was worried about him. This unexpected empathy disarmed him completely. "My mother doesn't hate me," he replied, his voice grave. "She hates what she can't control." Remembering Mrs. Davies's words, Chloe gathered her courage. "Was she always like this? So harsh?" she asked, looking up at him through her tears. "Even when you were a child?" The question caught him by surprise. No one had ever asked about his childhood. He looked out at the dark garden, memories surfacing. "My father taught me that feelings were a weakness," he confessed, his voice little more than a whisper. "And my mother taught me that status was everything. Love, affection, they were currencies to be traded, not gifts." He paused. "This house has always been full of people, but it's always been a lonely place. In that moment, under the pale moonlight, they weren't the millionaire and the purchased bride. They were just two lonely people, sharing a vulnerability that no amount of money could buy. Chloe's heart filled with an overwhelming compassion for this man who had been taught to build walls instead of bridges. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered, and it was perhaps the bravest thing she had ever said. He turned to her, his face inches from hers. He could see every tear on her lashes, the moonlight shining in her eyes. The attraction that had been growing between them, restrained and confusing, now exploded, becoming undeniable. Slowly, as if afraid she might vanish, he raised a hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the path of a tear on her cheek. "Chloe," he murmured her name like a prayer. And then he kissed her. The kiss began tenderly, a question, a testing of the waters. She responded with the same gentleness, their lips meeting in a dance of discovery. But the tenderness quickly gave way to something deeper, more hungry. The kiss deepened, charged with all the repressed emotion. The loneliness, the anger, the confusion, the jealousy, and the overwhelming desire they had both tried to deny. It was a kiss that said everything words could not. When they finally broke apart, they were breathless, their hearts beating in unison. They stared at each other, the world around them fading away. The line had been crossed. The seed of passion planted on the night of her revelation had finally bloomed, and there was no going back. The morning after the kiss on the balcony dawned differently. The sun streaming through Chloe's window felt warmer, the air less heavy. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she didn't wake with a knot of fear in her stomach, but with the vibrant memory of William's lips on hers. That kiss had demolished the final walls between them, replacing the fragile truce with an intimate and terrifying connection. When she went down for breakfast, he was already at the table. But instead of sitting at the distant head, he occupied the chair next to hers. The gesture was small, but its meaning was monumental. He looked up from his newspaper, and an almost imperceptible but genuine smile touched his lips. In that instant, they needed no words. A silent pact was sealed. From that day on, the dynamic of the house transformed. To the eyes of Eleanor or any occasional visitor, nothing had changed. The marriage remained a formality. But in their private spaces, away from the world's gaze, a romance bloomed in secret. The nights became their sanctuary. After dinner, they would meet in the library where William, to Chloe's surprise, revealed a deep knowledge of poetry. He would read to her, his deep voice bringing verses of love and longing to life, while she listened, fascinated by the cultured, sensitive man hiding beneath the businessman's armor. On other nights, it was she who taught him to see the world differently, telling him stories about the stars from the balcony, tales her grandmother used to tell, full of simplicity and magic. The passion born from that first kiss deepened into a powerful current. The doors separating their bedrooms were opened, and the lonely nights came to an end. William, who had always seen intimacy as a transaction or a weakness, discovered in Chloe a surrender and tenderness that healed him. He made love to her with a reverence that surprised him, unwrapping her body with the same delicacy with which she unwrapped his soul. Chloe, who had feared that moment more than anything, found in his arms not the brutality she had expected, but a safety and pleasure that made her blossom. She fell hopelessly in love with the vulnerable man he only allowed her to see. The man who whispered his fears in the dark and held her hand as if she were the only anchor in his world. To the rest of the household, the only clue to the change was William's mood. He smiled more. The sharpness in his voice gave way to a patience that Mrs. Davies observed with quiet contentment. She saw the way his eyes searched for Chloe when he came home and the light that appeared when he found her. She saw the color return to Chloe's face, her once hunched posture now straighter, her laughter more frequent. Love was healing them both. It was on one of those mornings, about 2 months after that night on the balcony, that life presented them with the sweetest of surprises. Chloe had been feeling unwell, with slight dizzy spells and a weariness that wouldn't pass. Mrs. Davies, with her practical wisdom, was the first to suspect. With a knowing glance and a gentle smile, she suggested Chloe take a test. The result? 2 pink lines that would change everything. Chloe's initial panic was overwhelming. A child, a son born of a contract. Her mind reeled with the implications. What if William thought it was a trick, a trap to ensnare him forever? The old insecurity, the fear of being seen as a gold digger, returned with full force. That night, she waited for him in the bedroom, the small test hidden in her hand, her heart pounding uncontrollably. When William entered, he immediately noticed her distress. "Chloe, what's wrong?" he asked, concern creasing his brow. He sat on the bed beside her, taking her other hand. "You're pale. Talk to me." With a trembling voice, unable to look at him, she opened her hand and showed him the test. I don't know how. William, I swear I didn't plan this." He fell silent, staring at the small plastic object in her palm. The silence stretched for a minute that felt like an eternity to Chloe. She closed her eyes, bracing for the explosion, the accusation, the return of the ice-cold man who had despised her on their first night. But what came next wasn't anger. It was a rush of air as he released a breath, followed by a low sound, a mix of laughter and astonishment. "Plan it?" he said, his voice choked with an emotion she couldn't identify. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were shining. "Chloe, look at me. This is the best news I have ever received in my entire life." "But the contract, our story," she stammered, confused. "To hell with the contract," he said, his voice rising in a crescendo of pure joy. "This changes everything. This makes it all real. We are real, Chloe. We're going to have a baby." And then he hugged her, lifting her off the floor in a tight embrace and spinning with her around the room, laughing like a boy. For William, that news was the final epiphany. An heir was no longer a contractual clause to be fulfilled. It was the materialization of his love for Chloe, the seal that the happiness he had found was not an illusion. It was the beginning of a family. His family. While happiness blossomed inside the Sterling mansion, outside the shadows were gathering. News of Chloe's pregnancy spread like wildfire through high society, fed by the attentive ears of staff and the gossip that ran rampant at dinners and events. For Victoria, the news was a dagger to her pride. She had been replaced, humiliated, and now forgotten. The little girl from nowhere had not only stolen her place, but was about to give William the one thing she never could, an heir. Fury gave way to a cold desire for revenge. Damien, meanwhile, saw the situation through a business lens. William's newfound happiness had made him a more focused and unpredictable rival. Moreover, the idea of William, his arch-nemesis, finding domestic bliss was a personal insult. The mutual contempt they felt for each other was the only thing that drove him. It was Victoria who made the first move. She arranged to meet Damien at a discreet, elegant bar, a place where deals of all kinds were sealed in the shadows. "Our mutual friend seems to be living a fairy tale," she said, swirling a glass of red wine as Damien sat down. Domestic bliss never suited him. "It's disgusting," Damien replied, signaling the waiter. "And dangerous," Victoria added, her gaze fixed on his. "A happy William is a complacent William, but a betrayed William, a humiliated William, that's the man we know. Ruthless, destructive, and vulnerable." Damien smiled, understanding where she was going. "And what do you have in mind, my dear Victoria? A scandal?" "Something much better," she said, leaning forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "William may have fallen for the girl's purity, but deep down, he's still the same cynical man. His greatest fear isn't losing money. It's being made a fool of, especially by a woman. The wound from his last betrayal never truly healed. We just need to poke it." The plan they hatched that night was cruel and meticulous. Damien would use his charm to get close to Chloe under a pretext she couldn't refuse, perhaps a fabricated emergency involving her mother who lived in another city. He would be the helpful gentleman offering aid. Just a concerned friend, he would say. They would stage a situation, take photos from a compromising angle, an embrace that looked like a kiss, a conversation that looked like an intimate confidence. While Damien set the visual trap, Victoria would handle the psychological warfare. She would use her contacts to dig into Chloe's father's finances before the wedding, fabricating evidence that he and his daughter had planned everything from the start. Fake emails, doctored bank statements, all to build a narrative that the virginity, the romance, and even the pregnancy were part of a masterstroke to seize control of the Sterling Empire. "He'll never believe you," Damien said, skeptical for a moment. Victoria smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He will, because it will be me telling him. The scorned ex-lover who only wants to open his eyes to the truth. I know his weaknesses. I know which buttons to push. By the time I'm done, he won't see the little saint he loves. He'll see the worst kind of liar. They toast it, a toast to ruin, to betrayal. and to the dark pleasure of destroying someone else's happiness. Across the city, in the quiet of their room, Chloe rested her head on William's chest, both their hands on her still flat stomach, dreaming of baby names, completely unaware of the web of malice being woven around them, thread by thread, ready to ensnare and tear them apart. The weeks following the discovery of the pregnancy were the happiest of Chloe and William's lives. The mansion, once a mausoleum of solitude, filled with new energy. They spent hours discussing the future, choosing colors for the nursery, and daydreaming about the little life growing inside her. William treated her with an adoration that made her feel like the most loved woman in the world. He came home every day with a small gift, a fruit she craved, a book by an author she mentioned, gestures that showed her every word was heard, every wish important. The barrier of the contract had dissolved completely, replaced by a deep love and a genuine partnership. They were, against all odds, a family, and it was this radiant happiness, this newfound peace, that made the storm forming on the horizon all the more devastating. The trap was sprung with diabolical precision on a Tuesday afternoon. While William was in an important meeting, Chloe's personal phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. Chloe Sterling, a smooth male voice said. It was Damien. I apologize for calling like this. I know we're not close, but the matter is urgent and delicate. Damien? What's wrong? She asked, her heart beginning to race. Look, I have a contact at the hospital in your mother's town, he began, his tone heavy with false urgency and compassion. It seems she's had a fall. She's been hospitalized. I tried calling your father, but couldn't get through. I didn't want to worry William unnecessarily in the middle of a meeting, so I thought it best to speak with you directly. Chloe's world tilted on its axis. Her mother, alone in a hospital, panic blinded her to everything else. Oh my God, is she okay? What happened? The details are still vague, Damien lied smoothly. But listen, don't despair. I'm at a cafe near your house. Meet me in 15 minutes. I have the on-call doctor's number and I can use my contacts to get a jet to fly you there immediately. Please come. You shouldn't go through this alone. The offer, the readiness, the apparent kindness completely disarmed her. In her panicked state, she only saw a man offering help. Yes, of course. I'm on my way. And please, don't say anything to William yet. I don't want him leaving an important meeting for a false alarm. It was exactly the response Damien had hoped for. She threw on the first clothes she could find and rushed to the cafe. Damien was waiting at a secluded table in the back. The place was discreet, but with large windows facing the street, perfect for a photographer positioned on the other side. Chloe arrived, her face pale with worry. Damien, thank you for letting me know. Do you have any more news? She asked, sitting down. Calm down, breathe, he said, taking her hands across the table in a comforting gesture. The camera lens across the street captured the moment, their hands clasped, their faces close in confidence. I spoke with a nurse. It seems it was just a scare, a fractured wrist, but they're keeping her for observation. Relief flooded Chloe, and with it, tears. Thank God! She began to cry, a mixture of relief and accumulated stress. Damien, the consummate actor, stood and wrapped her in a hug. It's going to be okay, I promise, he whispered near her ear as she sobbed on his shoulder. The camera clicked again, capturing the perfect shot. William Sterling's pregnant wife in the arms of his greatest rival, her face hidden in his neck, the embrace looking anything but innocent. As Damien's part was being played, Victoria took center stage. She arrived at William's company unannounced, her face a mask of sorrow and reluctance. William, I need to talk to you. It's about Chloe, she said, her voice low and grave. William, who had been euphoric after closing a major deal, felt a chill. What about her? Has something happened? I'm so sorry, William. I'm so sorry, she began, opening her purse and taking out an envelope. I know you think she's an angel, but I can't watch you be deceived any longer. She handed him the papers. They were the forged emails between Chloe and her father, discussing the terms of the scam. They were the doctored bank statements, showing a substantial payment into Chloe's father's account right after the pregnancy news became public. The narrative was perfect, built on the foundations of William's original mistrust. This is ridiculous, Victoria. It's garbage, he snarled, throwing the papers on his desk. I know Chloe. She wouldn't do this. Do you know the woman you fell in love with? Victoria retorted, her eyes filled with false compassion. Or do you know the actress she was raised to be? She studied you, William. She knew your history, your distrust. She used the one thing that could break you, innocence. And the pregnancy? That was the checkmate, the guarantee that she'd get everything. William's mind was a whirlwind. The old insecurities, the ghosts of past betrayals began to rise from the depths where he thought he'd buried them. He wanted to scream, to throw her out of his office, but a poisonous seed of doubt had been planted. Then, Victoria delivered the final blow. "I know it's hard to believe," she said, pulling her phone from her purse, "but maybe this will help open your eyes." She turned the screen to him, and there it was. The first photo, Chloe and Damien hand in hand across the cafe table. And the second, the most damning one, Chloe in Damien's arms. The intimate, prolonged hug. "This was taken 20 minutes ago," Victoria said softly. "While you're here building a future for your family, she's seeking comfort in the arms of the man who hates you most in the world." William's world collapsed. The image, combined with the documents, was irrefutable to a mind already predisposed to suspicion. The pain was so sudden and intense it stole his breath. It wasn't anger. It was agony. The woman he loved, the mother of his child, the one person he had finally learned to trust. It was all a lie. The most cruel and elaborate lie of all. When Chloe arrived home, feeling calmer and immensely grateful for Damien's help, she found William in the living room. He was standing with his back to the door, staring out the window. A bottle of whiskey and a nearly empty glass sat on the table beside him. "William, you're home early," she said with a smile. "I had a scare today. My mother—" He turned slowly. His face was a mask of fury and pain she had never seen before. It was the face of the man from their first night, but 1,000 times more terrifying. "Your mother," he said, his voice low and hoarse, or the perfect excuse for a rendezvous. Before she could understand, he grabbed an envelope from the table and threw its contents at her feet. The photos. She looked down at the images, her heart freezing. She saw herself with Damien, the scenes ripped from their context, twisted into something dirty and treacherous. "William, it's not what it looks like." "I can explain," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "Explain." He laughed, a broken, terrible sound. "Explain how you and your father planned every step? The virgin bride, the sweet wife, the devoted mother-to-be? What a performance, Chloe. Worthy of an award. I was a fool, a complete and utter idiot, for believing a single word." "No, that's not true," she sobbed, taking a step toward him. "Don't touch me," he yelled, recoiling as if she were poison. The words that came out of his mouth next were the cruelest he could possibly utter, designed to destroy. "I should have known it was too good to be true. Women like you don't change. They just perfect the con. Tell me, was this always the plan? Seduce me, get pregnant, and then run off with your lover?" He paused, his gaze dropping to her belly with a contempt that broke her into 1,000 pieces. "Even this child, how much is its share of the deal worth?" The accusation was so monstrous, so unimaginable, it dried Chloe's tears. The love, the hope, the happiness, it all turned to ash. The man before her wasn't her William. He was a stranger, consumed by his own venom. And she realized the most painful truth of all. He had never trusted her. Not really. His love had been conditional on her perfection. At the first sign of doubt, he had condemned her without a trial. She said nothing more, just looked at him. Her broken heart splayed across her face. In that gaze, he saw the woman he loved die, and he didn't understand that he was the killer. She turned and walked up the stairs in silence. That night, while William drowned in whiskey and self-pity in his study, Chloe made her decision. She could not raise her child in this toxic environment, under the shadow of a father who doubted her honor and its very existence. With trembling hands, she wrote a note, not of accusations, but of a final, desolate farewell. "I loved you. May God forgive you for not believing in me." She went to Mrs. Davies' room. The housekeeper, who had heard the shouting and seen William's state, understood everything without a word being said. With tears in her eyes, Mrs. Davies helped the young woman pack a small bag, gave her all the money she had saved, and called a distant cousin, a trusted taxi driver, to take her away to the bus station in the middle of the night. The next morning, sunlight poured into a silent mansion. William woke up in his armchair, his head throbbing, his heart a black hole. He went up to her room, maybe to yell more, maybe to apologize, he didn't know. But the room was empty, the bed perfectly made, and on the pillow lay the note and her wedding ring. Her absence was a scream louder than any word. She was gone. And he, blinded by pain and pride, was for the first time truly and irredeemably alone. Chloe's absence turned the mansion into a luxurious tomb. The silence, once broken by her laughter or the soft music she liked to listen to, was now an oppressive weight. William wandered the rooms like a ghost, every object a trigger for the memory of the happiness he had destroyed. The nursery, with its walls painted the soft yellow they had chosen together, was a torture chamber. He would step inside and be choked by a devastating emptiness, the image of Chloe's shattered face haunting his every thought. For the first few days, rage and wounded pride still fought for supremacy, whispering in his mind that he was the victim. But in the loneliness of the long nights, the truth began to corrode his defenses. The pain he felt wasn't that of a betrayed man, but of a man who had made a terrible, irreparable mistake. His allies, however, were not willing to let him drown in his self-imposed misery. James, his best friend and right-hand man, was the first to intervene. Finding William in his study, surrounded by empty bottles, his eyes lost, he listened to the story of betrayal. As a rational man outside the emotional whirlwind, James found Victoria's narrative too perfect, Damien's appearance too convenient. "This doesn't make sense, William," he said firmly. "The Chloe I watched you transform alongside wouldn't do this. You've been manipulated." Driven by loyalty, James began to investigate on his own, using his resources to follow the trail of money and lies. While James searched for proof, Mrs. Davies delivered the emotional blow. She found William standing at the door of Chloe's room, her note crumpled in his hand. The housekeeper, who had watched him grow up, approached not with sympathy, but with a contained, righteous fury. "Are you looking for her in this room, sir?" she asked, her voice sharp. "The woman you accused and humiliated is no longer here. You drove her out. She betrayed me, Mrs. Davies," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "No," Mrs. Davies retorted, her eyes flashing with indignation. "She loved you. I watched her, day after day, caring for this house, caring for you. I saw the fear in her eyes turn to admiration, and admiration turned to love. She blossomed here, and you, for a moment, blossomed with her. But at the first sign of a storm, you threw her to the wolves to protect your pride. You didn't break a gold digger's heart, Mr. Sterling. You crushed the soul of the only person who has ever truly loved you in this house." Mrs. Davies's words were daggers in William's heart. They echoed the doubt he had been trying to suppress, the truth he didn't want to face. The final blow came 2 days later. James walked into his office and threw a dossier on the desk. Inside was everything. Bank records showing a large transfer from Victoria to the photographer's own confession, admitting he was paid to take the photos out of context, and most damning of all, a recording of a phone call between Damien and Victoria, where they bragged about the success of their plan and mocked William's gullibility. The raw, unvarnished truth crashed down on William with the force of an avalanche. He hadn't been betrayed by Chloe. He had been trapped by his own cynicism, by his chronic inability to trust. He didn't react with rage toward Victoria or Damien. All his energy turned inward into a guilt so overwhelming it left him breathless. He remembered every cruel word he'd said to her, the accusation about their child, the contempt in his eyes. He hadn't just unloved her, he had annihilated her. In that moment, the powerful millionaire died. In his place was just a broken man consumed by remorse. His sole mission, his only reason for existing, became finding her. He mobilized all his resources, but Chloe had vanished. Mrs. Davies, loyal to the young woman she had protected, refused to give any information. But William, desperate, pleaded with the housekeeper, not as a boss, but as a penitent man. Seeing the sincerity of his regret, Mrs. Davies's heart softened. She didn't know exactly where Chloe was, but she gave him the name of the small, quiet town the driver had taken her to, a place called Havian Wood. William didn't send his security team. He went alone. He drove for hours, leaving the city of skyscrapers and intrigue behind, entering a world of green mountains and clean air. Havenwood was the opposite of his world, a welcoming little town with a central square, an old church, and people who greeted each other on the street. And it was there, sitting on a park bench in the square, the afternoon sun lighting up her hair, her hands resting on her prominent belly, that he found her. She looked peaceful, but there was a permanent shadow of sadness in her eyes. His heart stopped. He approached slowly, afraid she would bolt like a startled deer, When she saw him, panic filled her face. She stood ready to run. "Chloe, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't run. Just listen to me." She stopped, her body tense, braced for more pain. But the man approaching wasn't the monster who had cast her out. He was a shadow of his former self, his eyes red, his face etched with anguish. And then, to her shock and that of the few townspeople passing by, the great William Sterling fell to his knees before her. "Forgive me," he sobbed, the tears he had never allowed himself to shed now falling freely, washing the stone pavement of the square. "Chloe, please forgive me. I am a blind, arrogant, stupid fool. I know everything, the trap, the lies. But none of it is an excuse for what I did to you, for what I said. I broke your heart, and I broke mine in the process. I love you, Chloe. I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my life. And if you give me one last chance, I swear I will spend every single day I have left proving I'm worthy of you and our child." Chloe stared at him, her own tears streaming down her face. The pain was still there, a deep wound, but seeing this proud, unbreakable man on his knees, completely undone, struck a chord in her soul. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. "Get up, William," she whispered. "People are staring." The reconciliation was a slow, delicate process. He rented a room at the town's only inn, and day after day proved his change through actions. He didn't try to buy her with gifts. He won her over with patience. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments. He sat in silence beside her on the park bench. He listened more than he spoke. He was relearning how to love her, this time with humility and trust. The moment that sealed their new beginning came 2 weeks later, in the middle of the night. Chloe's water broke. At the small town hospital, William held her hand through the entire labor, whispering words of encouragement and love, his face bathed in sweat and tears. And when the sharp cry of little Daniel filled the room, it wasn't just the sound of a new life, but the anthem of their redemption. Seeing William hold their son, his face transfigured by a love so pure and absolute, the last piece of ice in Chloe's heart melted away. Months later, the Sterling mansion was a different place. The doors were always open, and the most common sound was the laughter of little Daniel. Victoria and Damien faced the legal and social consequences of their actions, banished from the circle they valued so much. The story of William and Chloe became a whispered legend, a modern fairy tale, but for them, it was something much more real. It was proof that true love wasn't a paper contract but a daily choice, the choice to forgive, to trust, and to rebuild, even from the most painful ashes. Together, they were a family forged not in luxury or convenience, but in the fire of distrust, and reborn stronger, purer, and finally, unbreakable. And so ends the journey of Chloe, William, and little Daniel, a family born from a contract and reborn through the power of forgiveness. What a journey for William and Chloe, proof that even the most guarded hearts can break, make terrible mistakes, but also learn to forgive. We saw a love born from a contract, almost destroyed by distrust, and reborn through the power of redemption. Now, we want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment? The revelation that changed everything on their wedding night? The defense that turned him from tormentor to protector? Or the redemption on his knees in the town square, proving that love requires humility? Leave your comment below. If this story about a love that rose from the ashes moved you, please share it. A warm embrace, and until next time, when we'll continue to prove that the strongest love isn't the one that never falters, but the one that always finds the path to forgiveness.